Hello and welcome to Slow Sleep Stories. Today's tale is a Nazi teacher for Hitler's youth, the real story through WWI and WWII, the haunting journey of Wilhelm Day, German schoolteacher, swept by history's tide through war, loss, ideology, and redemption. Thanks. Before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Now, turn off the lights, get comfortable, and let's start this journey together tonight. Part 1: Young Wilhelm, Village Life Before the Storm. In the quiet village of Kaisersdorf, nestled among the modest hills of western Germany, the world still moved gently in the spring of 1914. The orchards were green, cows wandered lazily through fields, and a small schoolhouse stood beside the Lutheran church. Wilhelm, 26 years old and freshly married, was a schoolteacher, proud one at that. His fingers smelled faintly of chalk dust, and his voice was always calm. Even when the boys tried his patience by whispering behind his back, he wasn't tall, but he stood straight. His mustache was always carefully trimmed. Students feared his stern frown, but respected his fairness. He read Latin poetry in the evenings, and on Sundays, he would take long walks with his wife, Elsa, who hummed folk songs and carried her own weight in words. That summer, they planted a small garden behind their house. They dreamed of children. He painted the shutters blue. But as June rolled into July, Wilhelm began to hear whispers in the beer hall, at the post office, on the cobbled path to the bakery. An archduke shot in Sarajevo, the Austrians rattling their sabers, Russians moving troops. No one seemed sure, but everyone was suddenly watching the sky. Wilhelm wasn't worried. "It will pass," he said one evening as he folded his newspaper. "Just another political fire that will burn out." But by August, posters went up, 2 arms for the fatherland. The church bell rang not for a wedding, but for war. And Wilhelm's name was among the conscripted. A teacher, yes, but also a reservist one of the thousands prepared, just in case. He hadn't held a rifle in nearly a decade. Still, he reported as instructed. Elsa wept in silence, holding on to the edge of his coat like it might keep him in place. That night he couldn't sleep. He walked out into the orchard, barefoot in the dew. The apples were still green. A gentle breeze brushed the trees, as if the world hadn't noticed that something had cracked. He touched one of the apples gently. "It's not my war," he whispered, but it was. He boarded the train on August 7th, his uniform still stiff, boots too tight. The platform smelled of smoke and iron. Mothers waved white handkerchiefs. Children shouted. Someone played an accordion badly. Wilhelm looked back only once. Elsa wasn't there. She couldn't bear it. As the train lurched forward, a young man in the corner vomited from nerves. Another lit a cigarette and handed one to Wilhelm. "Nervous?" the man asked. Wilhelm gave a polite nod. "No more than I should be." The man chuckled. "They say we'll be home by Christmas." Wilhelm smiled, gently, skeptically, and "pigs might fly." That got a laugh, the first of many. The train chugged forward into the unknown, each puff of smoke stealing away the man Wilhelm had been. Their first stop was Cologne, then Liege, then deeper still. As they traveled, the trains filled with more uniforms, more boys pretending to be men. Some sang, others wrote letters. Wilhelm watched them all. He thought of his students, especially those with stubborn hands and fragile egos. War would devour them, and still, no one really understood. Not yet. The mood was still naive. They spoke of glory, of medals, of teaching the French a lesson. But Wilhelm said little. He had seen enough boys bluff their way through exams to know when a mask was slipping. They arrived near the front lines, just after Germany had invaded Belgium. The towns were scorched, windows shattered, horses wandering without reins. The war, already, had a bitter mix of sulfur, damp cloth, and something deeper, something human. That night, he wrote to Elsa by candlelight, "My dearest, I have arrived. It is not the songs and parades we imagined. It is too quiet. I have not yet fired a shot. But already, I feel the wind has changed. Please, take care of the garden. Remember the roses. Love always, WL." That was the first of many letters. But the tone would not remain so calm. One evening, a shell landed just a few hundred meters from their camp. The ground jumped. One of the boys cried out not from injury, but from the sheer terror of noise. Wilhelm helped him up, offered a piece of hard bread. Neither spoke. It was the first time Wilhelm realized that silence could be louder than words. He remembered a joke he once told his students about how Latin was only useful for monks and magicians. Now, in the dark mud of Flanders, even those old jokes felt too distant to touch. A soldier in his unit, Klaus, had brought along a harmonica. At night, he played a wobbly version of Silent Night. It wasn't December, not yet, but it gave the men something to cling to. Wilhelm started humming along, quietly, shyly. It was the first time he allowed music back into his bones since boarding that train. One morning, as fog curled low over the fields, Wilhelm stood watch. No birds, just mist and the faint scratching of rats. He thought of his schoolroom, the smell of ink, the sound of Elsa's laugh when he burned the toast. He missed toast, and then, through the fog, a sudden cry. A shot, another. Wilhelm ducked, heart pounding. But it wasn't aimed at him. It was a nervous Frenchman firing into nothing. Still, it reminded them all, this was real, no going back. Later, over stale rations, Klaus tried a joke. "If we survive this," he said, "I'm going to open a bakery, serve nothing but bullets and regrets." Wilhelm raised an eyebrow. "What kind of bread is that? Hard, German." They both laughed harder than they should have. That night, Wilhelm dreamed of Elsa's hands covered in flour, the village, the orchard, the blue shutters fading behind him now. The wind had indeed changed. The story of his life was no longer written in chalk, but in gunpowder. Part 2. Marching to War, the Call of Duty. The early days at the front were chaos wrapped in order. Wilhelm found himself among a throng of men digging trenches with hands that had once written poetry and held lovers. Mud was their new ink, shovels their pens, and orders were passed down. Like cold soup, seldom warm, never satisfying. On August 4th, 1914, the invasion of Belgium had begun. By the time Wilhelm arrived near the Western Front, the dust of the Blitz through Belgium was already settling, along with the guilt of its brutality. Burned farms, broken churches, children with hollow eyes. He didn't speak of those things. In his letters home, he wasn't sure Elsa would ever look at him the same way again. But war didn't wait for reflection. By late September, Wilhelm and his unit had advanced into northern France. The lines, once fluid, now tangled into a web of trenches that stretched for miles. Men dug feverishly, convinced it would be temporary. It wasn't. Trenches were the future, and soon they'd feel more like home than the beds they'd left behind. Wilhelm kept to himself. He had always been quiet, but now silence felt necessary like armor. He helped when needed, shared cigarettes he didn't smoke, and translated the occasional Latin graffiti scratched into barn walls. "Dulce et decorum est," he muttered. Once, running his fingers along a brick, he didn't finish the line. He met Ernst during a downpour in October. Ernst was younger, only 19, with ears that stuck out and a laugh that felt too bright for war. He'd been a baker's apprentice before joining up and constantly smelled faintly of yeast. Together, they formed a quiet bond. When not dodging bullets or wrestling with lice, they talked of dreams. "I wanted to travel," Ernst said one night, gnawing on dried meat. "See America, eat pie." Wilhelm chuckled softly. "You'd hate it. Everything's too sweet there. But the women, they might be worth the sugar." A raindrop slid off Wilhelm's helmet. Then came the artillery. The shelling didn't stop for days. Dirt flew like feathers. Men screamed, then went silent. Rats grew fat. And through it all, Wilhelm held to one truth. Each second he survived was a kind of quiet victory. On November 9th, during a reconnaissance mission, their unit lost 2 men. Wilhelm saw one of them, a Fias, hit squarely in the chest. There was no poetry in it, no glory, just red, then stillness. Wilhelm didn't cry. He couldn't. His body was conserving everything now. Water, warmth, even grief. They buried Matthias with a simple prayer and a bent tin cross. Ernst placed a piece of bread on the grave. "Think he'll need it?" Wilhelm asked softly. Ernst shrugged. "Can't hurt." In December, as the frost took hold, Wilhelm experienced his first military Christmas. Rumors of an unofficial truce danced through the trenches like fireflies. And on the 24th, something astonishing happened. A German soldier began singing a simple carol. The voice was thin but unwavering. Then, across the frost-bitten no-man's land, a French voice answered. Another song, another harmony. Men stood slowly, cautiously, hands raised, guns lowered, and then they met in the middle, smiling, confused, afraid. Wilhelm stood frozen, watching Ernst exchange buttons with a British boy, not much older than his youngest student. "Name's Charlie," the boy said. "Your friend's got a terrible accent." Wilhelm smirked. "We don't get many French tutors in Bavaria." Someone passed out chocolate. Another poured weak wine from a canteen. For a few precious hours, war felt far away like a bad story someone else had told. They even played a game of football. Wilhelm didn't join. His knee had been bothering him, and he feared looking foolish. But he cheered them on, laughed as Ernst tripped over the ball and blamed the mud. That night, under a canvas of stars, Wilhelm wrote again to Elsa. "Tonight, something holy happened. I don't know if I'll ever see such kindness again. But I did tonight, in the cold." In the space between trenches, he paused. His hand trembled slightly. "There is still music in the world, my love. There is still light." The following morning, it was over. An order had come down: no more fraternizing. Anyone seen out of the trench would be shot. The soldiers nodded. No one protested. Rules were rules, even when they broke hearts. Wilhelm watched as Charlie, the English boy, returned across the field. The boy turned once, gave a small wave. Wilhelm waved back, unsure if he was saying goodbye or farewell. January brought bitter, cold and bitterer news. Ernst developed trench foot. His toes had blackened. They evacuated him behind the lines, and Wilhelm never saw him again. He asked around. No one answered directly. Just a nod, a glance. Silence again. In February, Wilhelm was promoted to corporal, not for bravery, but for surviving longer than expected. He wore the stripe uneasily. Leadership felt foreign, like a coat tailored for someone taller. He tried to protect the new boys, teaching them tricks to keep their feet dry, to know the whistle signals, to never light a cigarette at night. He even told a joke once. "What's the difference between a sausage and a general?" The boys stared, confused. One gets smoked by fire, the other just sends orders. It wasn't a great joke, but it earned a tired chuckle. In war, that was gold. Then, as March whispered across the fields, the wind shifted again. Something deeper was coming. He could feel it in his bones, in the way the earth felt restless. One of the sergeants mentioned Verdun. Something's building there, he muttered. Big push, real big. Wilhelm didn't know then that Verdun would become a name carved into history, but he remembered how the older officers looked that day, like men remembering something they wished they could forget. As he prepared his pack, Wilhelm found a folded piece of paper tucked beneath his rations. A letter from Elsa, smudged with fingerprints, but legible. The garden misses you, the shutters are chipped again, and I still hum when I walk to the bakery. She had signed it simply, always. Wilhelm pressed the letter to his chest, then folded it once, gently, and slid it into the inner pocket of his coat right next to his heart. Verdun was calling. Part 3, Verdun Burns, The Unforgettable Siege. By early February 1916, Wilhelm's breath came in misty bursts as he marched through the snow-crusted roads of northeastern France. Boots cracked the frost, rifles clinked in rhythm, and behind his ribs, his heart beat a slow, deliberate drum. Verdun was no longer a rumor. It had a scent, a direction, a deadline. They arrived near the front on the 18th of February. It was the calm before history shattered. Wilhelm stood in a shallow trench, staring at the chalk-colored clouds above. They looked like stretched wool-soft innocent lies. On February 21st, the sky fell. The bombardment began at dawn, and it didn't stop for over 9 hours. A rain of shells over 1 million, by some counts, descended upon the French defenses. The earth pulsed and heaved like it had a heartbeat of its own. Men screamed without sound, mouths open in silent terror as the explosions drowned out everything. Wilhelm tried to steady his breath. 1, 2, inhale, 3, 4, exhale. Next to him, a young man named Albrecht vomited into the mud. The stench mingled with cordite and blood. Wilhelm placed a hand on his shoulder, not for comfort, but to ground them both. They were real, still here, still breathing. When the push began, Wilhelm's unit advanced into the blasted terrain. Trees had been ripped from the roots. Horses lay torn open. The wounded cried for mothers. Some begged in French, others in German. The pain didn't respect uniforms. He stepped over a fallen soldier with no face and whispered, "I'm sorry." The dead had become so many, so frequent, that apology felt like a ritual. By March, the battle had turned into an endurance test. Verdun wasn't a war, it was a grinding machine. The French held with desperate courage, launching counterattacks that spilled rivers of blood. Wilhelm's rifle jammed more times than he could count. Mud and body parts clogged every mechanism. In early April, Wilhelm's commanding officer was killed in a blast that also took part of Wilhelm's hearing. For 2 days, everything sounded distant, like the world had been wrapped in wool. His new role as acting leader came with no ceremony, just the cruel reality of still being alive. He kept the men moving, organized supply checks, dug new firing positions. At night, he barely slept. His dreams were short films of horror repeating. Images of Albrecht's frozen eyes, of rats tugging at a bandaged leg. Food was hardtack and coffee so bitter it could peel paint. Morale was held together with gallows humor. Why did the Frenchman bring a ladder to battle? Someone croaked. Near a fire. Wilhelm blinked. To get to the high command. It wasn't funny, but they laughed. Not at the joke, but at the absurdity of still finding breath for laughter. By May, Wilhelm had memorized the shape of every crater. He knew which corpses were fresh and which had become permanent residents of the mud. In the distance, Fort Dalmont rose like a broken crown, battered, bruised, but unyielding. On the 23rd, he led a team of 5 to scout the fort's perimeter. Smoke clung to the ground like fog. They crawled on their bellies, eyes darting, mouths dry. Halfway there, a mortar hit behind them. Wilhelm's ears rang again. 2 men were lost instantly, no screams, just red mist. He returned with a limp and a stripe of blood across his neck. Not his, someone else's. That night, Wilhelm sat alone behind the lines. A medic offered him a cigarette. "I don't smoke," he muttered. The medic shrugged. "Might be the only warmth you'll find tonight." He took the cigarette, didn't light it, just held it between his fingers like a relic from another life. Then came the letter. Somehow, through the tangled bureaucracy of war, a message had arrived from Elsa. Her handwriting trembled on the page. "Wilhelm, the school has closed. The children are scattered. I wait each day by the window, watching for your letter. I press my hand to the glass and imagine your breath on the other side." He read it 3 times. Each word carved a space in his chest. He imagined her there, alone, humming the tune she always sang while sweeping. By June, he had stopped marking days. Time had lost its meaning. He ate when there was food, slept when he collapsed. His eyes had taken on a constant flicker like candles in a draft. He barely recognized his reflection in puddles. Just a thin, hollowed man with mud crusted into every crease, and then a miracle, or what passed for one in hell. Wilhelm was pulled from the front lines, promoted again. This time to sergeant. His commanding officers had noticed his leadership, his calm under fire, his ability to keep others breathing. He didn't feel like a leader. He felt like a scarecrow that hadn't blown over yet. But he accepted. He spent July training fresh recruits. Boys, really. One of them, Kurt, had lied about his age. Said he was 18. He was 15. Wilhelm taught them how to survive, how to crawl without being seen, how to laugh once in a while. They called him Papa Wilhelm. He let it stick. When the French launched another counterattack in August, Wilhelm was briefly sent back to the front. This time, he felt detached, like a ghost watching his own past. He shot a man that day, saw his eyes, knew he was young, knew he might have liked music. Still, he fired. That night, he wrote nothing, but he did speak to the stars, to the sky, to whatever gods might be listening. "I'm not the same," he whispered. "Tell her I'm not the same." By the end of 1916, Wilhelm had been rotated to a quieter sector. Verdun had become legend. Over 700,000 casualties, so many lives for so little ground. And yet, it had changed everything. It was the first time Wilhelm had truly understood the permanence of war's scars. He didn't cry, but sometimes, when no one was looking, he would touch the edge of that one cigarette, the one he never lit, and feel something close to warmth. Verdun was over, but something darker still loomed ahead. Part 4: The Collapse Begins. A second war within. The war was supposed to end by Christmas. That's what they said in the beginning. Now, it was 1918, and Wilhelm had lost the concept of supposed to. Instead, he held fast to reality, the ragged, bitter kind. He no longer flinched at gunfire. His hands worked faster than his mind. He had become a creature of habit, not hope. In August, the Allied forces launched their grand offensive. Tired feet-up soldiers on both sides dug their heels into the slush and dirt. But the difference was clear. Germany had begun to wither. Supplies were low, morale even lower. When word of the Allied breakthrough at Amiens spread, Wilhelm felt the shift. It was as if the air had grown heavier. The silence between shellings stretched too long, like something was holding its breath. His unit had moved north again, this time with whispers of retreat following close behind. Wilhelm's orders were to hold a key railway junction, but the maps didn't matter anymore. The lines were redrawn daily in sweat and blood. Bombs fell like punctuation. The story of every day ended the same. Bodies in new positions, fewer names on the roster. On the morning of August 14th, he woke to screaming. Not gunfire, actual screaming. One of the younger soldiers had cracked. Delirium, they said. He'd been speaking to a tree stump, convinced it was his mother. Wilhelm dragged the boy away and wrapped a blanket around his shoulders. "It's all right," he said gently. "You're just tired." He wasn't. He was broken. So were they all. Back in Germany, the hunger was spreading. Letters from Elsa became shorter. One simply read, "There is no bread." Another, "The neighbors boil weeds." A third, "Your nephew died from fever." Wilhelm read them without blinking. He'd grown skilled at swallowing grief like cold souped quickly, quietly, with no second helpings. In October, the rumors became orders. Pull back, conserve ammunition, prepare for withdrawal. And then it came, whispered through ranks, like a ghost. "We've lost." It wasn't official yet, but everyone felt it. By November, the collapse wasn't just military, it was national. Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated. Revolution sparked in Berlin. Sailors mutinied. Workers took to the streets. For the first time, Wilhelm didn't recognize his country, not the muddy trenches, nor the gray skyline of newsprint headlines. Everything felt hollowed out. On November 11th, the armistice was signed. 11 a.m. The guns stopped. Just like that, Wilhelm stood in a damp field, his rifle at his side, and listened to the silence. It wasn't peace, it was the silence of breath held too long. He thought of all the men who had died just hours before it ended. He thought of the boy who'd screamed at the stump. He thought of Elsa, waiting at a window. He said nothing. He just sat down in the mud, and for the first time in 4 years, let himself cry. Not loudly, not theatrically. Just a slow, steady stream of tears that cut tracks through the grime on his cheeks. When Wilhelm returned home, the village hadn't changed much, but the people had. Men avoided his eyes. Women whispered in bakeries. There were no parades, welcome signs, only ration books and hollow cheeks. Elsa met him at the gate with quiet arms. They didn't kiss right away. They just held on to each other like two survivors clinging to a single raft. That night, he sat in the same chair by the fire where he had once read children fairy tales. Now he stared into the flames, wondering if he could ever tell stories again. But something inside him itched, something unsettled. The war had ended. Yes, but the fight hadn't. Germany had lost, and Wilhelm watched his country flail in the aftermath. In 1919, the Treaty of Versailles confirmed the humiliation. War guilt, reparation payments, land stripped, the military gutted. Wilhelm read the news like obituaries, each clause another nail in the coffin of the Germany he once knew. He couldn't sleep, so he walked. At night, through the frost-touched fields, he wandered like a ghost, sometimes barefoot, sometimes armed only with a flashlight and thoughts too loud to ignore. The people were angry, and it was in that anger that something began to grow. By 1920, Wilhelm found himself attending meetings, not military ones, but civilian circles. Veterans, teachers, shopkeepers, all of them sharing one thing, a need to belong again, to rebuild, to reclaim. Wilhelm listened more than he spoke. He wasn't ready yet. Then came 1923, the year of bread, riots, and wheelbarrows of money. Inflation spun so wildly that Elsa once used a 10,000-mark bill to light a fire. "It's cheaper than wood," she joked. Wilhelm almost laughed that year. He was approached by a former comrade. "You should teach again," the man said, "but not math or grammar. Teach pride. Teach history the right way." Wilhelm resisted. For a while, but the spark had been lit. He began giving small lectures in the village schoolhouse. Topics like what makes a nation strong and the truth about the armistice. His words were careful, persuasive. He never used slurs, never shouted, but he asked questions that stirred something. Why were we blamed? Who truly lost? Why are we still starving? People listened. More came. Parents brought sons. One night, a boy of 12 raised his hand and asked, "Can we make Germany great again?" Wilhelm didn't answer right away. He looked out the window, past the frost, into the dark horizon. "Yes," he said finally, "but only if we never forget what they did to us." The boy nodded, and Wilhelm saw the fire catch. Part 5: Seeds of Control. Building the Future from Ash. The schoolhouse always smelled of old chalk and damp floorboards, but now it pulsed with a different energy. Chairs scraped closer, boys sat straighter. They listened not because they had to, but because they wanted to. And Wilhelm no longer Papa Wilhelm, but Herr Stoller, stood at the blackboard, speaking with precision and purpose. It began simply. He framed Germany not as the aggressor, but the betrayed. He spoke of dignity, of strength, of tradition. He told just about trenches and hunger, but about betrayal, about how the nation had been forced to kneel. And he told it gently, with pauses, as though reading a bedtime story to a child who had been wronged. One boy, Klaus, came early every day to help light the stove. "You make it make sense," he whispered once. Wilhelm smiled softly. It should have never stopped making sense. By 1926, Wilhelm's small lectures had grown into organized classes. The children came willingly, but the curriculum shifted. More flags on the walls, more maps of Germany with old borders shaded back, and there were no tests-only recitations. What do we owe our fatherland? How does a soldier show loyalty? The answers came with practiced pride. Still, Wilhelm never raised his voice. He didn't need to. He asked questions that answered themselves. One winter, he took his group to a war memorial. Snow drifted softly around the stone as Wilhelm spoke beneath the frozen sky. "Your brothers sleep beneath this earth," he said, "but their dreams are not yet fulfilled." One boy cried. Another offered a stiff salute. The groundwork was laid. And then came the introduction, quiet, deliberate, to a name that had been circling through newspapers and whispers. Adolf Hitler. Wilhelm first read about him in 1920, when the man led a failed coup in Munich. At the time, he had dismissed him as another loud soldier with too many medals and not enough books. But by 1929, Wilhelm read Mein Kampf in a single weekend. It was troubling. It was disjointed. It was extreme. But beneath it, he felt a current, a rhythm that matched his own resentments. When Hitler began gaining support, Wilhelm attended a rally in Berlin out of curiosity. He stood at the back, arms folded, skeptical. But the crowd moved like a river. When Hitler spoke, their silence was electric. Each word landed like a promise, each pause filled with the audience's breath. Wilhelm didn't cheer. He simply nodded. The man knew how to read the wound. In 1932, Wilhelm officially joined the NSDA, National Socialist German Workers' Party, not as a fanatic, not as a man swept up in hysteria, but as someone who saw, with careful eyes, where the wind was turning. he wasn't alone. Half of his students' fathers had already signed up, and when Hitler was appointed chancellor in 1933, Wilhelm did not smile. He simply said, "It begins." Almost immediately, the structure of Wilhelm's teaching changed. No longer a side pursuit, it became national duty. The Hitler Youth Hitlerjugend was growing fast, absorbing boys like dry wood takes to flame. Uniforms were handed out, books rewritten, songs rehearsed with clean harmonies. Wilhelm was promoted. He was no longer just a teacher, he became a trainer, a mentor, a moral compass for young minds pointed toward a singular future. His job was not to educate, it was to sculpt. He began each meeting with ritual. Who are you? We are the future of Germany. What do you believe in? Blood and soil. He led field exercises, teaching endurance and precision. He drilled them in posture and poetry. He smiled more often now than practiced smiles that didn't quite reach his eyes. Sometimes, during rest breaks, he would tell a joke. What's the difference between a Frenchman and a snail? The boys tilted their heads. One leaves a trail of slime across your doorstep, the other eats it. The laughter was nervous, but they laughed. He would wink, then move on. The jokes didn't matter. The loyalty did. Wilhelm noticed change in the boys. Klaus, once the stove-lighting boy, now corrected others in line. "Fix your collar," he barked. "Stand straight when you sing." Wilhelm watched. He didn't interfere. Instead, he reinforced. When a boy asked, "Why are Jews not allowed to join?" Wilhelm would pause, placing a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "Because we must be clean in thought, blood, and spirit. Imagine painting with a brush dipped in oil wood. It mix with water. No, it would smear. We must protect the picture." The boy nodded slowly. He never asked again. By 1936, Wilhelm was helping organize regional youth camps. Each summer, groups of boys would gather in the woods, learn survival skills, sing songs by the fire, and recite nationalist creeds under the stars. To an outsider, it looked like wholesome activity. But underneath, every word was laced with ideology. Every hymn hid a sharper edge. One night, around a fire, Wilhelm recited an old tale story about a wolf protecting its den from a circling pack of foreign dogs. When he finished, a boy asked, "Is Germany the wolf?" Wilhelm stared into the flames. "We are the den," he replied. "But we must become the wolf." That phrase would stick. The next morning, the boys painted a crude wolf symbol onto their banner. By now, Wilhelm rarely visited the old schoolhouse. He had moved on both in rank and reach. His title was formal, Regional Youth Development Officer. But to the boys, he was something greater. He was the voice of what made sense. He was the man who made their confusion feel like purpose. And he was proud, but sometimes late. Very late, he would sit alone in his small study beneath a flickering oil lamp and trace the spine of that cigarette, the one he had never lit. And he would ask himself, quietly, "Is this the fire they wanted me to tend?" But then he would close the box and sleep soundly. The future was rising. Part 6: The Uniform of Belief. Loyalty wears a brown coat. The boys called themselves wolves now. Wilhelm had not told them to, not directly, but he had smiled when they first painted the snarling head onto their camp banner. And from that moment on, it became a badge and identity. At each gathering, the chant echoed across forest canopies. "We are the pack. We protect the den. We become the wolf." It no longer felt like school. It felt like ceremony. And Wilhelm, though his coat remained brown and his demeanor remained calm, had taken on the robes of something more priestly than pedagogical. He no longer spoke of history as dates and maps. He spoke of it as prophecy. Germany was always meant to lead, he would say softly, pacing before rows of upright boys, each in polished boots and pressed khakis, but we forgot who we were. And when a people forget their blood, they let others define it. There was always silence after those lines, the kind of silence that meant attention. One morning in 1937, Wilhelm received a letter, an invitation, sealed with the official red stamp of the Reich's Ministry of Education. They had taken note of his effectiveness. They wanted him to advise on curriculum. Wilhelm didn't hesitate. He traveled to Berlin, where stone buildings loomed like ancient judges, and walked into the ministry with a quiet nod to the guard. Inside, he met men in sharper uniforms, stiffer collars. They spoke the same language he did, though theirs was clipped, more ambitious, more polished. They asked him what children needed. Direction, Wilhelm replied, not information. He returned home with a new briefcase and a reinforced purpose. From then on, his lessons included more biology, not plants, not cells, but charts. Charts about skull shapes and eye colors. Lessons about racial hygiene, illustrated with soft pastels, like they were talking about vegetables, not people. One boy raised his hand. But what if someone has a Jewish friend? Wilhelm walked slowly to the front of the room, looked the boy in the eye, and said, "Would you invite a sickness into your house, even if it smiled at you?" The boy said no. That was all it took, in 1938. After Kristallnacht, there was glass in the streets, shimmering in gutters like broken stars. Shops shuttered, synagogues blackened. Wilhelm did not participate, but he watched, quietly, sternly. Then the next day, in his morning address, he told the boys, sometimes the body must shiver before it can sweat out the illness. No one questioned him, and still he spoke in a tone so calm, it lulled more than it shocked too many. He was not a radical, he was reasonable. That year, the wolves doubled. Even younger children came, 7, 8 years old, some still learning to tie their boots. Wilhelm introduced a new chant, gentler for the smaller mouths. We are the seed of fatherland. We grow strong in German land. They said it with pride, fists thumping their chests like miniature soldiers, and Wilhelm made sure they believed in the strength of roots. He assigned the older boys tasks, tending gardens, mending fences, watching the younger ones. He called it stewardship, but it taught control. It taught order. Power, he said once, while watching Klaus supervise drills, is not given, it is practiced. Klaus, now 17, grinned proudly. He had become everything Wilhelm had once imagined. For the German youth, obedient, driven, utterly devoted. He corrected younger boys with a firm voice and clear eyes. One evening, as the group gathered under lantern light, Wilhelm handed Klaus a leather-bound notebook. "You'll lead the exercises next week," he said. "I'll be in Munich for a conference." Klaus accepted the task with solemn pride. After Klaus left, Wilhelm sat alone in the tent, the smell of firewood in his clothes. The stars overhead blurred by soft fog. He poured a small glass of schnapps, let it warm his throat, and whispered into the dark, "They were right. If we start early, they don't question." But still, sometimes a question tugged at the edge of his thoughts, like a splinter in the brain. Had he truly chosen this, or had it grown around him, like ivy on a house, slow and creeping? No matter. It was too late to repaint the walls. In 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. The wolves howled when the news reached them. "We are marching again," shouted Klaus. "Now in uniform, they will fear us again." Wilhelm gave no speech that day. He simply watched. The fire crackled. The boys danced in circles. That night, alone again, he fingered the edges of the box with the old cigarette in it. His fingers trembled slightly, perhaps from age, perhaps from memory. He thought of the first time he'd taught, back in that dusty classroom in 1912, thought of the map of Europe and the smell of wet coats on rainy mornings. Then he thought of the boy who screamed at a tree stump in 1918, and he closed the box again. No questions. Just duty. When conscription expanded in 1940, many of Wilhelm's boys were called up. They went eagerly. Some didn't return. Others sent letters from the front scrawled, proud messages. "Thank you for making me ready." One wrote. Wilhelm kept that one in a drawer. He didn't cry, but one day in spring he found Mother on his doorstep. She held a telegram in one hand and her son's cap in the other. "He died with honor," she said, her voice flat. Wilhelm placed a hand on her shoulder. "I'm proud of him." So why, later that night, did he drink alone until the bottle was dry? Perhaps it was because even wolves can feel the teeth of winter. Part 7. Ashes of the Dream. War at the Doorstep. Wilhelm had stopped whistling in the mornings. Once, he used to greet the sunrise with small, cheerful notes out, little tunes that wandered between keys. But now, in 1941, the mornings began with silence. The war was no longer a distant thunder. It had entered the towns, the homes, the schoolyards. There were fewer boys in uniform at the training grounds. Most had gone. Some never came back. Their names, carved into polished plaques, lined the walls of Wilhelm's hall. Flowers were left beneath them, not fresh ones, dried, brittle, like memory. Still, he persisted. Wilhelm never asked whether this was the end or merely another chapter. He simply kept going, teaching fewer boys, writing fewer letters, speaking more softly. His uniform was crisp, but older now, the seams gently worn at the elbows. Berlin had grown grimmer. In his occasional visits to the capital, he noticed the colors fading. Even the red banners fluttered with less arrogance, as if the wind no longer saluted them. Coffee was weaker, ration books fatter. Even laughter had turned hollow, like echoes bouncing around in abandoned rooms. But Wilhelm didn't falter. He adjusted. The lessons changed, again now focused on endurance, sacrifice, standing firm through total war. The boys were told not just that Germany would win, but that they had to believe it to make it so. Truth was not a question anymore. It was a responsibility. But the truth, like frost, crept in through the cracks. In 1943, a group of boys returned early from a training march. Their faces were pale, their boots muddy. They were hanging people in the forest. One said, barely above a whisper. Wilhelm stood still for a long moment. "Who?" he asked softly. The boy hesitated. "Civilians." A long silence. Then, "Not everyone understands discipline," Wilhelm said. "That's why we must show it." No more questions followed, but later that night, Wilhelm burned that week's lesson plan and wrote a new one. No more stories of wolves, only roots, stones, mountains, immovable things. As air raids increased, the camp moved underground. They converted cellars and old bunkers into makeshift schools. The flicker of oil lamps danced against damp walls, casting shadows that looked like marching soldiers. The boys sat on crates and rubble. Still, they listened. Still, Wilhelm taught. By now he had begun using softer language, again teaching through metaphor, as he once had with seeds and soil. Perhaps the old part of him, the man who once read fairy tales to toddlers, was stirring again. But even stories couldn't silence the sirens. In 1944, one of the largest raids hit Wilhelm's town. Fire rolled through the streets like a living thing. Bricks screamed. The bell tower cracked and spilled down into the marketplace. Wilhelm's training hall was reduced to charred beams and blackened stone. He found the wolf banner, half-burnt, snagged on a tree limb. He didn't cry. He folded it, smoothed the corners, and placed it in his sacked CHEL the next day. He gathered the remaining boys not in a line, not in formation, but in a quiet circle beneath a railway bridge. "This," he said, pointing to the soot on their boots, "is what belief looks like when it's not protected." One boy asked, "Are we losing?" Wilhelm looked toward the east, where the horizon glowed faintly red. "Not yet," he said, "but the ground is colder." More boys died. Even younger ones were now given rifles, wooden stocks, heavier than their shoulders could bear. Wilhelm watched them march toward a front they couldn't see, into a war they didn't understand. He stopped attending strategy meetings. He stopped writing reports. He taught poetry instead, not political verses, but old German lullabies, shepherd songs, even silly rhymes that once belonged to nursery days. He made the boys sing softly in the safety of bunkers. Sometimes they laughed again, just for a moment, just long enough to remember they were still children. One day, near the war's end, Wilhelm returned to his study. The windows had been blown out months before, the panes replaced with wooden boards, but inside, the dust was undisturbed. His books still lined the shelves, though some had been removed by the authorities, deemed inconsistent. He sat at his desk and opened the drawer. There it was, the old cigarette, still unlit. He didn't take it out this time, he just stared at it. So much had been lit in the years between, and all of it, fire, towns, people, hopes. He wondered, briefly, if he had ever meant any of it to go this far. But regret has a quiet voice, and by then, the cannons were louder. In April 1945, the Allied tanks rolled through nearby roads. The town surrendered with barely a whisper. The brown coats were folded and hidden. Some burned, some buried. Wilhelm didn't run. He sat in the schoolhouse, now a ruin with no roof, and waited. The sunlight filtered through broken beams. The air smelled of rain and metal. When the soldiers arrived, they found him seated in front of the blackboard, chalk still in hand, though nothing remained to teach. He stood up, nodded once, and said, "Only, it's over." They arrested him without struggle, as he was led away. A child, no older than 7, peeked out from behind a cracked wall. Wilhelm looked at the boy, smiled gently, and said, "Sing something silly tonight." The boy didn't answer, but he watched until Wilhelm disappeared behind a column of dust and soldiers. Part 8, Final Campfire, The Quiet Reckoning and Slow Release. Wilhelm sat in silence for most of the trial. The courtroom, though warmer than the cell he'd come from, still felt cold in its gaze. Men in black robes and armbands stared with hollow eyes, asking sharp questions like knives. Their voices clipped and dry. They wanted admissions. They wanted remorse. But mostly, they wanted clarity, something Wilhelm himself no longer had. He answered with the same soft tone he'd always used in the classroom. "I only taught boys to be strong," he said. They called him evasive, complicit, a quiet architect of influence. One witness, now a young man with a scarred face and uneven voice, said, "He never yelled. That's what made it worse. He made you believe it was all gentle." Wilhelm lowered his eyes. There were names, many names, files, papers, testimonies from former students and parents. Some defended him, said he had merely followed orders, merely filled his role, but others told of the boys who never returned, of the poison wrapped in nursery rhymes. He was not sentenced to death. The world had other punishments. Instead, Wilhelm was sent to a denazification camp, a place designed not only to house but to unmake. The uniform was stripped, the titles erased, the name teacher left behind like a torn-up book. The first weeks were spent moving rocks. He didn't complain, didn't speak much either. But in the evenings, when permitted, he walked the perimeter of the camp's fence, not to escape it, to look at the stars. One evening, another man, older, bent-backed, wearing an old French military coat, walked beside him. "You were one of the soft ones," the man said. Wilhelm didn't respond. The man chuckled. "I mean that as a curse." They never walked together again. Seasons passed. Inside the camp, Wilhelm was required to attend classes: history, ethics, reflection. He listened, quietly, never interrupting, but occasionally his fingers would twitch, as if drawing chalk lines on invisible blackboards. He kept a journal. In it, he wrote poems, reflections, lists of names. Sometimes he drew wolves, not fierce, but tired, curled up in snowy forests, asleep beneath moonlight. One page bore only one sentence: "They trusted me with their wonder." In 1948, he was quietly released, one among many, deemed no longer a danger. No trial, no statement, just a signature and a train ticket. He returned to his hometown. The house had been bombed, the garden gone. Neighbors didn't look him in the eye. He lived quietly, repairing shoes to get by, planting herbs in a cracked clay pot. No one called him Herr Lehrer anymore. Children didn't knock on his door, but every morning he brewed coffee, even when there was only barley and chicory left. The smell filled the small room. He sat by the window, writing quietly in his journal, his eyes distant but still searching. In 1953, Wilhelm wrote one final letter. It was addressed to no one in particular. To the boys who sang the songs, to those who marched and those who wept, to the one who painted wolves with trembling fingers. I saw you. I remember your names. I once believed I was building you into something unshakable. But now, I only hope you grew into men who asked questions. He signed it simply, W. He placed the letter in a tin box, along with the folded wolf banner, and buried it behind the stump of a long-dead oak in the woods where the first camp had stood. No one would find it, not for a long time. One winter morning, Wilhelm did not rise with the sun. The coffee stayed cold. The notebook lay open, pages fluttering in the breeze from a cracked window. On the final page was a drawing, a single campfire, surrounded by silhouettes, boys, seated, heads tilted upward. Above them, stars like tiny eyes. No words, just silence. Wilhelm was buried with no ceremony, no family present, in a shared plot. A local gravedigger placed a single stone at the head, no name, just the word Lehrer. But the woods remembered, and sometimes, on quiet nights, when the wind moves just right through the leaves, it carries with it an old melody, a rhyme, soft and slow. We are the seed of fatherland, we grow strong in German land. The wind does not judge, it only remembers, and then it falls quiet again. Wilhelm, once a gentle school teacher, shaped by his love for order and tradition, emerged from the wounds of World War I with a hunger for meaning and belonging. As the rise of Hitler's regime promised clarity and control, Wilhelm found his purpose within the Hitler Youth, shaping boys into young soldiers of belief under the quiet strength of his voice. Through the 1930s, he transformed from educator to indoctrinator, leading with kindness but sowing seeds of loyalty wrapped in myth, obedience, and silence. His lessons abandoned questions for certainty, slowly weaving ideology into lullabies and drills. The boys followed, trusting, admiring. Some vanished into war, some returned broken, some never returned at all. As World War II deepened, Wilhelm clung to routine, even while cities burned and innocence vanished. By war's end, he faced arrest, interrogation, and slow accountability, not with rage, but with the resignation of a man who had once believed he was doing good. His punishment was not death, but the slow unraveling of self. Years later, alone and unknown, Wilhelm continued to reflect on the boys he once taught. The wolf banners, the marches, the lullabies, they haunted him gently, like ghosts who never raised their voices. In the final chapter of his life, Wilhelm reached no absolution, but left behind a letter, a drawing, and a silence more honest than any speech. This story is not about loud monsters, it is about quiet ones, and how, sometimes, the most dangerous teacher is the one who never raised his voice, never questioned the script, and never stopped believing he was helping. Good night.